Good afternoon. My name is Lorena Yancura, and I'm a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I'm presenting my work on relationships matter. Intergenerational conflict predicts stress and depression in grandparent caregivers, along with my colleague Melissa Barnett. I have no commercial relationships to disclose. And I'm going to start by reminding you how important grandparenting is in the lives of older adults. Since 2001, the number of grandparents in the U.S. has grown by 24%. It's gone from 56 million to 70 million. And many of you know that this is due to the increases in the numbers of older adults in the population in general. Almost all adults, 96%, are grandparents of one kind or another, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. And the grandparenting experience of older adults is important, absolutely critical to their well-being. So I also want to remind you, because this is a conference with gerontological professionals, that grandparents are part of families. But this is where it gets a little tricky. Families are hard to define, and I'd like to remind you of the famous Supreme Court Justice, Potter Stewart, who originally was asked to define obscenity. Now, he thought, and he could not come up with a definition of obscenity. But he said, "I'll know it if I see it." Now, I'm not calling grandparents obscene or families obscene, but they are similar in the way that families are hard to define. They can be defined objectively. People are either related by blood, that's objective, or residence, where they live. Sometimes step-grandparents are just the same as grandparents. They can be defined functionally by communication, how they communicate with families, what people call them, or the assistance they provide for each other. Or they can be defined subjectively, which is due to affection and emotional closeness. So related to that definition, grandfamilies are dynamic. Some research, in fact, most of the research on grandfamilies defines it in relation to where the grandparents live. But that changes all the time. Or some research might define it by blood, but two unrelated individuals can be just as close as grandparent and grandchild as related individuals. So grandfamilies are dynamic. Household structure can change, and also the level and type of grandchild care can change. We know for a fact that when children are younger, they receive more grandchild care than when they reach 18, because they need it more. So two theories within the field of human development and family studies propose that family relationships are important in the lives of older adults. The first one is intergenerational solidarity. You're probably familiar with that. The theorist was the famous Vern Bankston. And basically what Bankston said is that families stay together because of social cohesion. And he said that this cohesion happens on several levels or axes, similar to the definition of family that I gave above. Now, the other thing to remember about Bankston's definition is that even though it has the word solidarity in it, it allows for the fact that conflict happens between families. So I can tell you an example of my mother and my aunt. They stuck together like glue their whole entire lives, but as sisters, they had a lot of fights, even into their 80s. But still, they were a family unit. They stuck together. They had intergenerational solidarity. And the second framework that I really like, it's a relatively new one, is the multi-generational family life course framework. And what that basically says is that family members are affected by both family history. So if you have poor parents, the children are more likely to struggle financially, and by the time they live in. So there are age, period, and cohort effects that happen to families. And I think these are both very, very useful to think about the effects of family life on older adults. It's not just a snapshot of what happens over time, but family relationships change over time. And sometimes we know that something that happens decades ago, an event that happens decades ago, can come back to create some conflict or strife in families. So I'm turning now to research support for family relationships that affect grandparents. And there are 3 different lines of research, and I'm not going to go into these in detail, but basically a lot of studies have shown that grandparents' relationships with both, I'm calling the grandparents the G1, the first generation, their relationships with the G2, that's the parents or the second generation, affect their relationships with G3 and the grandchildren, and vice versa. So in one of my favorite series of studies, Catherine Goodman, and also along with Meryl Silverstein, noted triadic patterns of conflict and closeness. So what they did is they looked at how the grandparent got along with the G2, grandparent-parent relationship. They looked at how the grandparent got along with the grandchild, grandparent-grandchild relationship, and then how the parent and the child got along, G2 and G3. And they noted that these different patterns predicted grandparents' mental and physical health. And it's noteworthy that you would be surprised. You would think that the grandparent, the G1, G3 relationship that was good, and then the G1, G2 relationship that was bad, along with the G3, G2 relationship that was bad, you would think that 2 bad relationships would cause strife to the grandparent or would cause them to have poor mental and physical health. And that wasn't the case. They called that the isolated pattern. And in fact, the grandparents who had a healthy relationship with their grandchildren and no relationship with their actual children, the parents of the children, were fairly healthy. So that's just interesting to note. Zhang et al. Lately of 2021 used archival data from the Health and Retirement Study to look at dyadic conflict between simply the grandparents and the parents, G1 and G2, and they found that closeness predicted depressive symptoms differently for different types of grandparent caregivers. Notably, the ones that lived with both the grandparents and the grandchildren, we call those multi-generational households, those grandparents suffered worse when there was G1, G2 conflict. And then again, Rachel Donovan and her colleagues have recently looked at shared activities between grandparents and grandchildren, and showed different patterns in a relationship with between the grandparents and the grandchildren, depending on what they did together. So existing research has shown that family relationships matter for the health of grandparents. So given the theory and the research that we just described above, we predict that in a diverse sample of grandparents providing grandchildren, and by that we mean we've got full-time and part-time, we've got some that live with the grandparents and some that don't live with the grandchildren, we predict that caregiving burden, stress, and depression will be predicted by subjective family relationships, which I'll define in a minute, objective and functional family characteristics, and demographic characteristics when demographic characteristics are controlled. And we also anticipate differences in the prediction of the outcome variables, and that's an exploratory hypothesis. So now on to our sample. We had a nationwide sample obtained through Qualtrics panel service of 300 grandparents. The survey was completed by 338 participants, but 38 were dropped for missing data of some sort. Grandparents were all of children aged older than 18 years. Most were female and white, and all of them interacted with grandchildren at least several times per week. All of the grandparents agreed to participate in the study, which was approved by the University of Hawaii Committee on Human Subjects. So I'd like you to note here, to save time in the presentation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the sample at the same time that I start talking about the variables. So the grandparent age was self-report. The grandparents ranged from 43 to 80 years old with a mean or an average age of 61, a little bit under 61 and a half. The grandchild age ranged from age 1 to 18 with a mean of 7. And we measured their financial security with a 6-question scale modified from Conger, Reuter, and Elder. Higher scores mean higher security. The scale held together with a reliability of 0.88. The minimum score was 6, the maximum score was 600, and the mean was 345. So higher scores meant they were more financially secure. The health of the grandparents was assessed with a standardized scale. I'm sure you're familiar with the medical outcomes scale. And we had 14 questions. The the scale scores ranged from 14 to 55. The average score was 37, so the grandparents were relatively healthy, and those questions held together with a reliability of 0.94. So right here, before we go into the rest of the characteristics, I want to remind you that we had grandparents from different household statuses. Looks like 32 of them, so very few were from skipped generation household, and that skipped generation is when the grandparents and the grandchildren live together, but the parents are out of the picture for some reason. And often it's because the parents are on drugs or in jail, but it can be for a variety of other reasons. 118 of the grandparents were non-resident grandparents, and by that we mean that we saw the grandchild and they saw the grandchild several times per week and provided a great deal of babysitting but did not live in the same house. And about half were multi-generational grandparents, or they lived in the same house with all 3 generations, G1, G2, and G3. Here are how we defined the objective and functional family characteristics. We adapted these from a scale co-authored by my colleague, Melissa Barnett. And how we asked these was we simply gave grandparents a list of the types of things they did with their grandparents. So that's functional family characteristics, right? What do you do with your grandchildren? Excuse me, I think I said grandparents there. We asked the grandparents what they did with their grandchildren. And after we factor analyzed these, we came out with 3 factors. So in all of these scores, higher scores mean more of the quality. So for example, the factor of affection was made up of 4 questions: cheer up, laugh, love, affection. The range of that scale from 1 to 4, the mean was 3.76. So grandparents said they did a lot of affectionate things with their grandchildren. Teaching, similarly, there's a list of the items there you can see. The minimum was 4. And the maximum was 16, and the average teaching that grandparents did with their grandchildren was 11.6. And those items held together even better than the last one. They have an alpha of 0.82. Babysitting was I like to think of these as the nuts and bolts of child rearing. So when grandparents said they babysat, they disciplined, they take care of them when they were sick, they bought them things, they drove them places. And that was, again, assessed on a scale of 4 to 16. And those items held together with an alpha of 0.81. And we can see grandparents actually did a high degree of those duties for their grandchildren or for their parents, however you want to think of it. The subjective family relationships, this is what I was talking about when I said solidarity and conflict. These were grandparents' opinions of actually how they got along with the grandchildren and the grandchildren's parents. So the perceived partnership with the grandchildren's parents, or the perceived partnership with G2, we assessed with 6 questions. How dependable is the child's parent? How happy are you with their contribution, etc., etc.? Those 6 questions, I think that minimum should be 6 there. We had a minimum of 6 and a maximum of 28 with a score, a mean of an average score on that scale of 21. And that scale held pretty well together with an alpha of 0.85. And then the grandchild behavior was a similar list of questions of how we asked them how well the target child was doing in comparison to their peers in the following 5 domains: emotions, concentration, behavior, relationships, and physical health. And again, that scale held together really well with an alpha of 0.94, with a minimum score of 1, a maximum of 500, and a mean of 228. So we can see those grandchildren, I'd say, were behaved somewhere in the middle. Now, finally, here are our outcome variables. These are all standardized scales, so I'm going to go through them really quickly. We used burden, which was a modified Zaret caregiver burden inventory, but we changed the questions to reflect caring for a grandchild rather than caring for an older adult. And that burden scale reflected how difficult it was for the grandparents to care for the grandchildren. Then stress was a global stress scale, not just the stress associated with caregiving. And then depression is a well-known instrument. The Center for Epidemiological Studies Form D depression scale, and higher scores mean more depression. And all of those scales held very well together in this sample. They were very reliable. So here it is, the results you've been waiting for. And I know, class, this is going to be difficult to read, so I'm going to use my marker. So what we did here was something called a hierarchical regression equation, and I'll explain it as you go along. The first thing, we were predicting burden on this slide, and the first thing we did is we used all of those demographic variables to predict burden. And this column right here represents significance. And remember, we want things to be significant because that shows that we have found everything. And I hate to disappoint you, but the constant on a regression equation is always significant. That's just kind of a measure of your equation. But absolutely nothing was significant for the demographic variables for burden. So how grandparents felt about caregiving was not influenced by their age, the grandchildren's age, their financial security, their health, or whether they were of a minority status or not. Wow. So that was model 1, or step 1. Model 2, this is where it gets a little interesting. On model 2, we left those original predictors in because we're interested in the whole picture. And we added what we're calling our objective and functional family variables. So we can see here that burden in grandparents was predicted by whether they lived in a multi-generational household, whether they babysat for the younger generation. So grandparents clearly were burdened by babysitting. And then it was negatively predicted, you can see this negative sign here, by their affection for the grandchild. So that means their affection for the grandchild was protective. So if people had more affection, they had less burden. So interesting, right? So it's harder for grandparents to be in a multi-generational household and to do more babysitting. But here's where it really gets fun. Burden, when we kept everything else and added our relationship variables, look at right here. Burden was positively and very highly, that was significant at a probability of 0.01, less than 0.01, predicted by the grandchild's behavior problems and how they got along with the parent. Fascinating, huh? So let's look again for our next outcome. That's stress. So we can see slightly different outcome for our first model. Being financially secure and not so healthy predicted stress. So the less financially secure you were, the more stress you had. The poorer health you had, the more stress you had. That makes sense. And then we've also got age negatively predicting stress. And if you didn't see a lot of research with older adults, you might think, oh, really? That doesn't make any sense. But it kind of does. When adults get older, they get a little wiser and they get better at handling their problems. So there's normally a negative relationship between stress and age, particularly when we have adults into their 70s and 80s, which we do in this sample. So this stress is looking just like we thought it would. Let's take a look at the household predictors. And our other predictors remained fairly the same. When we added our functional predictors, it looks like grandchild age got a little, was positively related with stress. And that makes sense. There's older kids behave differently than babies, right? But the only significant predictor of stress was babysitting. So it's the duties. It's not the having fun with the grandkids, or it's not the affection. It's babysitting that's hard on the grandparents, whether or not they live with them. And then our third set of predictors, those relationship predictors, what stands out are that the relationship problems with the parent are what are the very strong, remain strong predictors of grandparent stress. Here's depression. I'm going to run through this because this presentation is running a little longer than I wanted, but we can see in step 1, there's that relationship. Worse health is more depressed, which we often see with adults. We still, on step 2, have that babysitting relationship show up. And we also can see financial security. The less financially secure you are starts to show up when we put the babysitting in there. And I'll talk about that in a minute in my results. And then again, as the theme of the presentation, the relationship with the middle generation, that parent, the relationship with the grandchild parents positively and strongly predicts depression. So there we have it. Our results show some very interesting patterns, but for me, the overall saying is what grandparents do with and for their grandchildren, where they live, those multi-generational households, and how they get along with the middle generation greatly influences grandparents' well-being. This adds to the growing body of literature on aging adults and family contexts. It shows that all of our hypotheses were supported and emphasizes the importance of families and life course perspectives on the well-being of grandparents, grandchildren, and grandparent-headed families. In the next steps to the study, after we know that our hypotheses were supported, we think that it would be a good idea to look at multiple informants. So in this study, we only asked the grandparents. We'd like to put together a study where we can ask the grandparents, the middle generation, and the children. Family histories seem to be very, very important. And then we'd also like to have a better list, a more comprehensive list of what the grandparents and the grandchildren actually do with each other. Now, of course, like every study, our study did have its limitations, including the typo that I just noticed on the slide. The implications for research, practice, and policy is that we need to consider fluid household structures, including non-resident grandparents. To date, much of our research has been on skipped generation grandparents, but we can see from this study and the others that I cited in my introduction that household status might not be as important as we originally thought. It's the overall relationship. We did have a very small number of skipped generation families. And it's obviously our cross-sectional study cannot address selection effects. And that's why I think in that very first slide with burden, we didn't show anything with health. It's because taking care of grandchildren might cause, I hate to use that word, I use that word very, very lightly, grandparents to have poorer health, but we can't tell cross-sectionally because the grandparents that are already sick are not going to take on that responsibility. So we have a selection effect. The grandparents that are taking care of grandchildren are probably healthier than grandparents on the whole because they chose to take on that extra responsibility. So that is it. I thank you very, very much for your participation, and also my colleagues, Danielle Nadar for her assistance at Project Conceptualization. She's at Mississippi State. And Kylie Oeda, my grad student at University of Hawaii, along with Rachel Scott and Acacia Lopez for their spectacular assistance with the statistics and data management.